All right, well, welcome back to another Ask Brian Boggs show. A couple of things I want to bring up before we get started into some questions that have come in. If you would please, before the show is over, just take a couple of minutes and give us a review right here on the iTunes program. That'll help other people find us, and it'll also help give us a sense of how we're doing. We really would like to hear from you. Each of these episodes that we've done so far has already been transcribed, and you can find that on chairmakers.com. And that's a really good way to go back if you can't remember the answer I gave to a question, or look for questions that you haven't heard an episode of. They're organized by topic, and they're really well set up so that you can look for a particular type of question and answer. So worth checking out. So you can follow, for this broadcast, you can follow it on Twitter at Chairmakers now, or you can go to the AskBrianBoggs.com, Instagram at Brian Boggs Chairmakers, the YouTube comment section, and Twitter at Chairmakers. Those are all places you can watch. You can also leave questions there through those formats. So lots of ways to get involved here. So we had this program, or this edition, is focusing on adhesives. We've got 6 questions in so far. We can get some more in, I think, during the show. We'll see how it goes. So don't hesitate to send questions in at this point. First question that came in was through Nate Aldrich. I'm finishing up a live edge top that has a knot hole I want to fill, but I want it to be clear so you can see it. And what type of finish would work best over a filler like that? So I actually didn't know the answer to this. I had to call my friends at Asphalt Hardware, because I know that they sell a product specifically for that. It's called Clear Coat, CLEARCOTE, and it's an epoxy, a 2-part epoxy fill. And it's a tabletop finish. You can actually finish the entire top with that. But if you just want to fill that knot hole, one of the challenges is going to be making a really good seal on the back side of that hole. And you might even want to consider gluing a piece to the back temporarily and then cutting it off later. My issue has been when I have a full hole to fill, is it's hard to keep epoxy from seeping out or even seeping into the wood so that you can't get a really good fill. But if you've sealed that from the back really well, you can just go on and fill it on up, and it should hold well enough. In terms of finish to go on top of that, a good urethane or polyurethane finish should do fine. One of the things that I was advised about with this Clear Coat product is it's very glossy, and so with a polyurethane or urethane finish on top of that, you'll be able to choose your own glossiness or sheen. So I hope that's helpful. Next question is from P. Kenneb. When using epoxy for glue, like a Maloof joint, how thick should it be? I'm guessing you're talking about actual space in the joint rather than the viscosity of the epoxy. But they're both important, because in a Maloof type joint, you've got a lot of area where the glue can seep out. So it's probably going to be real helpful to thicken it with something, either a wood powder, or I know that some epoxy companies sell a thickener that helps the epoxy stay in the joint so it doesn't just seep right out. So that's an important thing. If you've got a fairly tight joint, you don't want to clamp it super tight. More importantly, you want to apply the epoxy and give it 10-15 minutes at least to really soak into the wood, and then reapply again. The risk with not doing that is that after you clamp the joint together, the wood can actually pull so much epoxy away from the joint just through absorption that you won't get a full strength bond. Even if it does seem like it bonded, it might not be full strength. So the viscosity is important. Getting the wood to soak up, to pre-soak up the epoxy, is important. And having a little bit of a space. You don't want a totally tight joint. with a lot of clamp pressure. But I've found that you don't need a visible gap between the two parts in order to have enough epoxy in there to react. Especially if you allow the wood to soak up the epoxy first, you're going to have enough body of material there for the chemical reaction to take place. And that's the concern that a lot of people speak about with epoxies, is that if you don't have enough material present, unlike PVA glues or high glue where you can have virtually a molecule thick glue line, epoxy does have to have more material there, but allowing it to soak into the wood pretty much gives you enough body. And I know this because we use actually a 20-ton press in our laminations, and we're getting the wood to actually contact itself, or the two layers of wood in the laminations to contact themselves, so that the epoxy that's there is pretty much just the epoxy that has been soaked up into the wood. And in tests, those bonds have proven to be stronger than the wood itself. So you can have a nice looking joint as well as a really good bond, and not having to use so much epoxy that you've got a big, thick glue layer between your wooden joints or wooden parts. ADE Woodworking asks, what glue is appropriate for bent laminations that'll be outdoors? Type 3 PVA, polyurethane, epoxy, or something else? Or is steam bending a more reliable alternative for this application? Well, I've done both. The first outdoor chairs that I did were actually steam bent back slats in both walnut and white oak, which are pretty good outdoor woods. The client for this particular job insisted on domestic wood, so the choice was limited. Those did well, but if you're going to do a steam bend for outdoor use, I strongly recommend kiln drying the parts, even if it's just a box kiln, so that you're getting up well over 100 degrees and getting your moisture content down below 4%. Now that sounds ridiculous for outdoor furniture, but the point is not that you're getting the wood dry. The point is that you're locking the lignin in place. So you're sort of baking it essentially, so that it'll take more than rain to straighten these pieces out. They'll have to actually be re-steamed. And I was concerned about that for this order, because there were going to be 20 chairs. That's going to be 100 slats that have to be holding their curve. And I actually, as a test, put the slats that I had steamed, bent, and then baked to cure, put them back in the steamer, and I could not get them to rebend. So that does work. But if you're going to do a lamination, and we do all of our bends in our outdoor furniture now, because we're using mahogany, which is not a particularly good bending wood, we're using laminations, and we use an epoxy that I really like. It's one from Rot Doctor. It's called all wood epoxy. And the reason that supposedly the reason that it's so effective is that the resins are made actually from wood fiber or natural wood resins, so that they integrate really well with wood, particularly oily woods like teak or mahogany, and you get a lot of absorption, which is another reason why you want to wait and let the wood have time to absorb what glue it's going to absorb before pressing the parts together and making sure that you've not left dry spots. If it absorbs too much, you have to recoat. But all wood epoxy is a really good choice for that. I have tried polyurethane glue, disastrous results. PVA glues are moderately okay, but I don't think they're a great choice for lamination because they don't get hard enough. They stay too elastic. So your bonds are going to they're not going to be stiff enough to prevent movement of the bonded laminations. So I strongly recommend an epoxy, and my favorite is all wood epoxy. Another thing that I like about that particular epoxy is in our shop in the wintertime, we don't bother heating it very much. As long as it's 45 degrees, that's a pleasant working temperature. A lot of epoxies just flat out won't work at that temperature. All wood epoxy will work down to 28 degrees. So for those who don't want to heat your shop very much in the wintertime, it's a great choice. Patrick Gilbert writes in, I've seen people clean up PVA glue in so many different ways. It seems like even a small amount, if a small amount penetrates the wood, there will be some blotching during finishing, especially if stain is involved. What's the best technique? Let it sit and gel or meticulously clean up with water? Soaking up water immediately will dry toilet paper seems to keep the watery glue from soaking in. Thanks. Patrick, what I like to do if I'm going to be using PVA glues is to get at least one coat of finish on the wood first. And that saturates the fibers and minimizes the wood's ability to soak up the glue. Wetting the wood first, the surface of the wood first, will help saturate the fibers and keep the glue from penetrating. But when I do use PVA glue, I wash with water immediately after assembly, and I'm not afraid of using a lot of water. We just soak the thing, just completely soak the entire piece, and don't leave a wet edge on there, so that if the entire surface of the piece is soaked in water or saturated with water, you're not going to have a line where your glue water ended and your clean wood starts. That's going to leave your stains. Also, even if you don't get all of the glue completely off, if you've really used a lot of water, you've essentially diluted all of the glue so that you have a kind of a thin, uniform coat of glue there that's not going to show up very much in the finish. And I actually have never succeeded in getting all of the glue off in a single washing. So I'll wash the chair, dry it, and I'll wash the whole chair again, or whatever the product is, whether it's a case goods or anything, it doesn't matter. And I have not found that the water does any damage, and we use a lot of it. The wood doesn't soak it that deep, and so just wait till the next day to start finishing to make sure you've given the piece time to dry out completely. But that's our preference, and you make it a lot easier if you can completely finish the piece before assembly, if that's practical for that design. I actually used to do that with all of my chairs. In fact, we would put the final coat of wax on the parts before I even drilled holes for the legs. And that was a little risky, but glue just kind of fell off. There was just no issue of glue staining at all. That's kind of extreme, and it actually turned out to be more time consuming to try to handle the parts that carefully through so many applications of finish. But some finish, at least one coat of finish, is a big help. Dana Hanna 310 writes, I have the idea to glue several pieces of plywood together to create a wood base. Then I want to cut that into a shape. What would you suggest as the best glue? I don't want it to fall apart once the saw hits it. So Dana, what I would recommend is, first of all, get a really good plywood, because some of the cheaper plywoods aren't well laminated together and they have big gaps in them. So I'd strongly recommend a good quality birch ply. But for the glue, to glue those together, they all will work as long as your clamp pressure is good enough. Because of the requirement for clamp pressure with PVA glues, I wouldn't bother with high glue. The setting time is a bit of an issue, but PVA glue will work if you can get a good enough pressure. But epoxy is the safest one, because all you have to do is just put the pieces together. As long as they're touching, they don't require any clamp pressure at all, and epoxy will actually fill a gap if there is one. If you can possibly run your plywood through a thickness sander to make sure it's nice and the surfaces are nice and uniform and flat, that will help create a good bonding surface as well. So when I do stuff like that, I don't glue piles of plywood together, but we do actually have one design where we have a buildup of plywood, and just to be on the safe side, we use epoxy. It's that all wood epoxy. Byram Taylor writes in, do you use hide glue? If so, are you caught up with a double boiler and different grains, or just hide glue in a bottle? We do use hide glue. I've been using hide glue now for, I'd say at least 20 years. And I've started making my own early on, and was having trouble with it, and so started using Patrick Edwards' Old Brown Glue, which is what I would recommend if you're new to high glue. I would strongly recommend his glue. Just look up Old Brown Glue online. They generally keep a stock of it, and it's perishable, but we just keep it refrigerated, and it'll last for up to a year. One of the things I really like about that is he's formulated it for the longest open time you can have in a high glue, and it stays gelatinous at room temperature, so you'll need to warm it up, but it's really easy to work with. High glue, if you're going to make your own in a glue pot, just buy a regular glue pot. Several companies sell them. Most companies that sell high glue will offer a glue pot. It's not a double boiler, but I actually use as a double boiler. We make our own high glue. We use urea, and we use the I think it's the ultra clear version from Milligan and Higgins. But I think they only sell wholesale. You've got to buy a 50-pound bag or a 20-pound bag or something like that. That's a lot of glue. But learning to use high glue by making your own is worthwhile if you really want to get into making glue. It's not worthwhile if you're just using high glue occasionally. Patrick Edwards has totally solved that problem for us. But being able to make your own high glue and learning how to use it, and it's going to take a bunch of practice rounds, because the way you handle the high glue is very specific. In order to get a really good bond, you need a warm space. The wood can't be cold. But you can do things with high glue that other glues don't allow. And for that reason, we keep it on hand all the time. So I think that's the questions that have come in so far.
We got one question from interior maker B. Hagen, and it's how to make oak look like it's natural and not golden, but stain, water rings from cups, etc., resistant, question mark.
So it sounds like she's wanting a clear finish on white oak or oak that is going to be tough enough to resist rings but not color the oak. That's really not that hard, and it kind of depends on whether or not you like the open grain of oak. To really get a good clean finish, I would recommend filling it. A lot of people don't like that.
Invisible finish.
Invisible finish.
So it doesn't look, I guess when she finishes it, so it doesn't look yellow. Wait, like it's natural and not golden. So I guess she wants to retain some sort of a natural look. And if she puts the finish on, it makes it kind of have a golden look. She wants it more invisible, so it's not changing it that golden look, I guess.
That's going to be a little tricky because most finishes do have something of an amber tone, and I think that's what you're trying to get away from. Waterborne finishes, on the other hand, are perfectly clear. Now, they don't always give you a rich look, but we've had pretty good luck with General Finishes in Durovar. That one actually is intentionally tinted to give you that amber look, but it still looks pretty darn clear. But I would experiment with some of other General Finishes, other waterborne finishes, and see if those are going to give you what you like. It's hard to talk about tones without looking at the piece and getting a response from a specific piece of wood. But just from an email like that or a written question, it's kind of tough to understand what you're.
And she is a he.
She is a he. Okay. Sorry about that. So yeah, you're just going to have to experiment, but waterborne finishes are going to color the wood the least. Lacquer is another option. Shellac is an option as well, and shellac you can get shellac in pretty darn clear tones, and shellac is one of the most waterproof finishes that we've got. It's not real durable, but it is very waterproof. What are you pointing at here?
He's just commenting.
Oh, maybe clear super matte floor lacquer. Huh. Yeah, I think it's going to take some experimenting. There's, in choosing a finish, which we'll get into finishes on another show, but in choosing a finish, it's always a matter of choosing which compromise you're going to accept the best. And one thing that you're wanting is a very natural finish. You want it to look like wood, and every finish is a layer of plastic of some type, even shellac. It's going to create some kind of a plastic layer. This table that I'm on right now has a very thin wipe-on poly. It's actually not a Minwax wipe-on poly. It's polyurethane that's wiped on very thin, and it's a very natural finish. But polyurethane it's going to have an amber tone. The thinner the finish, the less it's going to impact, of course, and the less it's going to protect. So again, those are the compromises you're always battling with: is how much protection do you feel you need, and how important is the look of wood. That protecting against rings is going to require a film finish. I've never experienced an oil finish that gives you that wood feel that will never leave a ring. So, you have a question?
Question in from Rusty. He says, "Can you please talk about how hide glue works with dyes and finishes? Also, would you recommend it for edge joining for tabletops?"
Can you clarify the question about dyes and finishes? Are you wondering how hide glue in a joint is going to react to a finish applied on top of it? In terms of edge joints, there's no advantage in using hide glue for an edge joint. All of its properties actually are a disadvantage in an edge joint. So I would strongly recommend a PVA glue for that. I have tried hide glue, and it's that large an area, well, assuming you're talking about a tabletop, it's really tricky to keep it warm enough, and it's very vulnerable to heat and moisture. So if somebody sets something hot on the tabletop, the joint can pop. Now, the same is actually true for PVA glue, but it's less sensitive than hide glue is. So I would strongly recommend a PVA glue like Titebond or Titebond 2. Did you come back with the clarification about the...
I'll read it again. It says, "Can you please talk about how hide glue works with dyes and finishes?" So I guess the reaction...
I guess you're talking about getting hide glue in the grain, and I use the same method for washing off the wood after hide glue as I explained for the PVA glue. Just use a lot of water and wash the whole area twice, and just make sure you get it off. And you're not going to hurt the furniture with water. It's going to dry off, and the more water you use, the better. It'll just flush the glue off. One of the things about hide glue that's really great, though, is if you do miss it and you can see it later, it's a lot easier to see the glue stains or glue spots on the wood after your first attempt at washing has dried. And then you can go back and spot hit those with warm water and just like a piece of burlap or some kind of coarse cloth to give you a little bit of an aggressive scrub without scratching the wood. But just like any other glue, hide glue on the surface of wood under a finish is going to leave a stain. It won't do so immediately, which is kind of a problem. It'll show up later because it makes a light spot. It keeps the wood from darkening or behaving like it normally would under a clean coat of finish. So it's not any more of a problem than any other glue, but it doesn't solve that staining problem for you either. So that's a wrap. Folks, if you want to check out prior episodes, go to YouTube and look us up there. iTunes also has past episodes, and this one will be transcribed as well and will eventually show up on chairmakers.com. So glad to be with you again, and look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Thanks.